Good morning, one and all. This is the opportunity to listen in to Claire Boorman, who's the winner of the latest AQR Qualitative Excellence Award, which was started in about 2003 from memory. And the format is that Keisha, who is on the judging panel, will introduce her and give a bit of background. Claire will take it away and give you her insights. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have some questions from you all. Please just fire them in and I will keep an eye open for them. And after that, I'll just give you a sort of inkling of what AQR has planned for coming weeks or coming months. And we'll say bye-bye, but thank you for coming. And I'm looking forward to this. So hey ho.
Great, thank you, Luella. And hello, everyone. My name is Keisha, and I sit on the AQR board, and I'm also the judging panel for the AQR Excellence Award. So last year, during my time as a judge, I had the opportunity to review lots and lots of high quality and thought-provoking entries. And they all came in from agencies, consultants, clients across the qual industry. And it was really heartwarming to read all of these excellent entries, because we all know, like, over the past couple of years, it's been a very trying time, especially for qual, and we've had a number of different obstacles. So seeing the innovation from different agencies and just how they've approached qual in a different way was great. And looking through all those entries and choosing our winner, it was a great experience. And I'm really excited to introduce our winner, Claire Boorman from Boxclever. But before I introduce Claire, I wanted just to give everyone a bit of an overview of the AQR Excellence Award. I know there might be some new faces here, but I think it's all really good for us to recap on what the AQR Excellence Award is about. So we're in our 19th year, and it's an award that is highly esteemed. And within the qual industry, it is the most prestigious award out there. And the aim of the award is to really highlight and recognize the incredible contribution that we all know that qual makes to marketing, to strategy, but also our cultural understanding and our grasp on societal issues. So it's there to really showcase that qual excellence that we hear and see about within the industry. And every award always has a panel, and our panel is a distinguished one. And we have representatives, not just from AQR, but from Aura, from MRS, APG, and SMR, and lots of other bodies. And when we all come together, we look for a number of different things when we're judging the award. So we look for great qualitative thinking, that is key, but also a great story. We're looking to see how you tackle the brief, so how you start from the brief and take it all the way to having impact on your client's business. And with that impact, we really want to understand how your research has encouraged your client to pivot, to improve its business or do something different. So we're really looking to understand that, as well as understanding how you've pushed the boundaries of qual. We know that qual touches on different disciplines, so we're looking to see how you've incorporated qual with other disciplines, but also that innovation there as well, doing something a bit different and having that bit of creative genius. And when we looked through all these entries and we decided on Claire's case study being the winner, we found that it just encapsulated everything we were looking for. It was a brilliant case study, and it really was a great example of that creativity in qual, but also that strong collaboration with the client and really working together to create a new, successful and disruptive brand. So before I hand over to Claire to talk through her case study, I will just quickly introduce her. So Claire is one of the founding partners of Boxclever. She's very passionate about qual, as we'd expect from one of our winners, and is also an activation specialist. Claire started her career in research as a grad at Nunwood, and during her time there, she built up the business and led on qual and international projects. She then went on to found Boxclever in 2010. So that's Claire, and that's a bit of an intro to the Excellence Award. So I'll now hand over to Claire to talk through her case study.
Keisha, so I'm going to just share my screen so you can all see our slides. 1 second. So hopefully everyone can see a beautiful landscape. So I'm going to tell you all about our obviously winning case study for the AQR Qualitative Excellence Award. So we're very proud winners. I have to say we've entered a few times before and not been winners. So it's brilliant this year to be able to firstly tell this story to everyone that wants to listen, but also to have recognition as well. So I'm going to tell you really the story of the project today. So I wanted to make sure that you really felt you understood that journey we'd been on, and really the journey that our kind of client, the Isle of Raasay single malt, has been on as well. So it's a journey for them as much as it was for us across our project. So I am going to tell you a story today. I'm going to tell you a story of how the Isle of Raasay single malt, a challenger brand, it's fair to say, an entrepreneurial brand, and a brand that had no prior experience of the whisky market at all. So its founders, its directors had not played in this space at all as a brand prior to 2017 when we started talking to them. So this story is about how a challenger brand took on the global whisky market and shook it up. And a story about how pivotal insight was, and particularly qualitative insight, in making that journey happen as a facilitator. And a story, of course, with a happy ending. You know, who doesn't want a happy ending to this this journey? So I will really let you know where the brand is at now as well. So where did we begin? So first of all, I thought I should really introduce you to R&B Distillers. So this is the parent brand behind the Isle of Raasay Scotch whisky, which was our brand to develop and launch. So R&B Distillers is a small artisanal distillery. They're based on an island called Raasay, which is pretty remote. It's a North Scottish island off the coast of Skye. It's beautiful, it's tiny, it's isolated, it's full of passionate people, very small population. You can only get there by boat. There's no airport. It's isolated in the truest sense of the word. And back in 2017, the business had a really simple aim. They wanted to launch into the mature, traditional, global Scotch market, whisky market, with a new single malt brand, a totally new brand. Obviously, they were an entrepreneurial brand, so a startup effectively. So to be commercially viable, the new brand they were launching really had to command a premium price point. But not only command a premium price point, do that for a product that was going to actually take far fewer years to produce than a kind of typical whisky. All of this in the context of a very traditional whisky market, which generally has long production times, and those production times equate largely to quality and allow them to justify a premium price for the product. So our challenge was to help the brand build an identity and a brand positioning that, despite being a young whisky, could compete on perceptions of taste and quality and could go on to command that higher price, premium price point. So for those of you that don't know the whisky market very well, I'll just do a little bit of a recap. It is a mature market. It has very established measures of quality. So the most expensive brands in the market tend to be the oldest. They tend to take about 25 years to produce. And there's really established category rules and conventions in the whisky market. So an older whisky tends to be much heavier in taste, assumed to be higher quality, and is thus much more expensive. A younger product is a bit lighter in taste, is seen as lower quality, and is a bit cheaper. And Scotch whisky, out of all the types of whisky, is the most premium in the world, with single malts being the most expensive and prized within that. So ultimately, our new brand had a really big challenge here to compel consumers to pay a top price for a product that we knew would not display those traditional quality credentials. It was going to have to buck all of those category conventions. It was going to have to reinvent how quality was created and evaluated. And it was going to have to create really fresh and compelling reasons to believe in the new brand. So all of those allowing it to justify a premium price point. So it was a big challenge, and we weren't sure, in all honesty, at the outset, how that challenge would play out in terms of what we would learn from our consumer journey. If we fast forward 3 to 4 years since then, it's fair to say that the Isle of Raasay single malt has flown off the shelves to real critical acclaims. It's been really well received by the market and by consumers. Its pre-orders sold out, its first release, you could hardly get your hands on a bottle. It was snapped up instantly. And actually it was the creative development of the brand with Qual Research particularly at the heart of how to define that compelling identity that really lit up that path to commercial success. And of course, all of it done on a really tight budget as a challenger brand across that journey. So we're going to tell you a little bit about how we did that through the rest of the presentation. Okay, so insight was really critical throughout our journey with the client to help show how we could reframe the category, and in doing so, how in helping us determine what that brand positioning should look and feel like. Without research, I think it's fair to say we would have really struggled to define what the brand should stand for and actually how it could go about creating a distinct meaning that was going to force consumers to reappraise quality. So we had a limited budget and we had to really layer our approaches so each quite clearly delivered on a very different objective. So we got the most out of that budget in doing so. We also looked to different markets, to experts, and to the wider industry to help future-proof that brand positioning. So our first stage of research was a quantitative one, actually, and our objective here was to firstly size the market for a premium whisky product, and in doing so define the target typologies from a consumer point of view. And those typologies were really aligned by their response to the category and their response to premium whisky and the attitudes that they showed. And this approach enabled us to really focus in on our sample design for our qualitative ethnography and for our workshopping. So we weren't wasting our budget trying to stretch across typologies that perhaps weren't open to this kind of proposition. We then held conversations with experts, with leading edge consumers, and those helped to highlight trends in the marketplace. So understanding how some of those category truths also were moving as the market activity was playing through. So there was activity in the Japanese brand market, there was activity in other parts of the market. We wanted to understand, what that was doing to some of the category truths that we knew existed. We then conducted some ethnographic work, so observation in New York and in London, in the whisky bars and in premium hotel spaces to really understand how brands were working. We, alongside that, conducted category semiotics in store, in selected stores, not across the entire space. And this helped us assess how brands were creating standout and showed where some of that white space might be in which the new Raasay brand could play. And then we conducted a series of creative stimulus-led workshops. So these unpicked consumer needs and within those target typologies and started to help us understand how we could challenge convention and assess the most compelling emotional messages that could form some of those foundations for brand identity and brand positioning. Really importantly, in these sessions, we use storytelling exercises, and these helped us understand the kind of language, the kinds of concepts, and the imagery that consumers were using in order to describe their relationship with the category, their relationship with particular brands, and to really start to unlock how and what we needed to say in order to start to challenge some of those category truths. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that the most powerful whisky brands were really powerful in the way that they told stories. So they left our consumers with a really emotionally rich sense of their brand. And that tended to be grounded in either its history or in this kind of imagined visual landscape in which the brand was placed. And that insight really indicated that the brand development should be inspired by three key themes. And the first of those was a sense of place. Also, the dramatic landscape that was associated with Rasay. And thirdly, a focus on modern. So I'm going to talk a bit about each of those in terms of what those meant for the rest of the journey. Okay, so firstly, a sense of place. So in our ethnography, it really revealed how whisky is first and foremost about the place it's distilled in. There's a huge variation in taste between the Scottish distilling regions particularly, and that tends to be based on peat profile, on the water, on the processes that are used. And that brings provenance right to the fore for consumers in how they start to navigate the category. So we saw an opportunity for the new brand to take provenance and start to really leverage it and play with it differently. So to describe the use of local resources, local water, local barley, local peat as a differentiator, and to start to craft that into a story with a set of reasons to believe in taste and in quality. We also uncovered at this point that the heritage story behind a brand tended to be the most unique or motivating aspect that tipped consumers into consideration. So that was what made the difference in knowing about a brand and in wanting to try it. So from a Rasay point of view, the history of Rasay as a place drove interest. So the tiny island, the existence of illicit distilling on the island since time began was fascinating for consumers. The isolation, the sense of mystery. So there became a really clear opportunity to use the idea that distilling was going to be resurrected on the island as a hook that could drive trial, and to tell that story in a really compelling way. So based on that insight, historic place became a really important emotional identifier at the heart of the brand story. So it started to be used on the bottle, in the visitor centre, in communication, on the website, in terms of starting to drive connection and drive consideration for the brand. So if we just take a look at how that's playing out now. So if you look at the website, for example, we can see how a compelling sense of place really sits at the heart of brand identity. So for example, some of the language here, we've got the sentence, rooted in centuries of illicit distilling, the Hebridean Isle of Rasay provides the ingredients for the perfect dram. So we're dialing up provenance in our ingredients, we're dialing up a sense of place and historic place in terms of that idea of centuries of illicit distilling. And that story is threaded through how the brand presents itself. It was all about knowing that we needed to leverage this dramatic landscape that the island itself sat in and make that work for the brand. Our imagery exploration in the qual really clearly indicated that the brand needed an iconography. So it needed a photographic backdrop by which it could tell its story for it to make sense to consumers. However, with so many Scottish distilleries, and a really great sense of unfamiliarity with all those varying landscapes of Scotland, it was really difficult to find ownable landscape that would be unique to Rasay and drive consumers to the brand rather than just being associated with the category and driving consumers to the category. So whilst we knew that evocative imagery was a must, we knew also that we needed it to be an ownable visual asset. So, for example, something that could reference the bottle or something that could connect in with the brand or its story. So based on this insight and understanding that interplay with category and brand, the structure of the actual glass in the bottle was designed really specifically. So it was actually designed to reflect the rockiness of the landscape, but also to be beautiful, to stand out in store and in bar, and in doing so to really communicate those premium credentials that were so important to its positioning and its price point. So we can see, again, this story is really articulated directly to consumers on the blog on the website. And actually, they tell a story of how the bottle was designed. Our decanter-like glass bottle captures the island's rugged natural beauty in all its glory, with Rasay's fossils and rocks moulded into the glass. Holding it is like holding a piece of Rasay in your hands, no matter where you are in the world. So it's become part of the brand and it's ownable. And our third insight was to ignore young, but actually think about modern. So one of our clear hypotheses and objectives coming through from our engagement with stakeholders at the outset was really trying to fathom out what difference it made to the brand being young and not having that 25, 30 years distilling credential behind the brand, and whether that was a significant barrier and how we should tackle that. So through our workshops and our ethnography, we explored all of those associations with young whisky, where that distilling time might be reduced from, say, 25 years down to 3 years. And whilst it's fair to say that the less traditional consumers did recognise that the market was kind of shifting in that direction, there was an overwhelming groundswell of negative connotation, and that really dominated understanding or willingness to engage with the brand. That led us to clearly recommend that we needed to shift away from thinking about communicating whisky age. This was not something we could win ground on, and therefore we needed to think again. But actually what we also heard in our work was the value in emphasizing innovation and in emphasizing modernity in the practices around which the brand was centered. And that helped lift the brand, and it helped consumers feel that it was relevant to their world and that they could create compelling connection with the brand and a relationship that they wanted to build going forward. So based on this insight, the team at Rasay were able to really focus on what the brand needed to do to deliver a modern interpretation of some of those traditional values. And for them, modern values meant doing things differently. It meant being courageous and actually shouting about it. From our semiotics, we saw that some of the brands were relatively traditional and old-fashioned in some instances, but also very quiet and reserved and a backdrop to their own story. And for Rasay, there was a deliberate intent coming through from this insight to be loud and modern and courageous in how they presented every aspect of the brand. So modern and courageous kind of became the day-to-day currency for all decision making. So it wasn't just about the identity, it was about how they were as an organization. So for example, this impacted in lots of ways. It impacted on the design of the website. So there was a deliberate intent to create a warm and contemporary tone of voice, to use a really impactful and bold way of talking to consumers that felt very, very different from the kind of staid world of middle-aged whisky of old. It impacted on distribution strategy. So a strategy that was about focusing on specialists, about focusing on upmarket bars, contemporary hotels, spaces that our more youthfully minded consumer would want to be in. And there was a deliberate move away from selling through the grocery multiples, and actually the brand is not in the supermarkets to this day. There was also a focus on being courageous and modern and warm in how we built a relationship with consumers, and actually a decision was taken to do that largely through the online space. So for example, the Whisky Loyalty Club was created, which really gave lots of benefits for consumers and built a connection with them. And social media was used really, really widely in order to drive that sense of modern and connectivity through lots of activity in the social space. Okay. Qualitatively, we also discovered that rare, unique, and unusual were really, really compelling in this space. So we started to help the R&B kind of start to utilize behavioral science heuristics like scarcity to start to think about how to drive demand. So we were approaching launch strategy at this point. So really, there was a lot of decisions around how to launch the brand. And actually, it was decided that the brand, because of this sense of wanting to be unique and rare, that the brand wouldn't just sell the first release to consumers. Instead, it would ensure that not only was there a limited amount of product to sell at launch, and it was a small release of product, that actually if consumers wanted to access that first release, they would not be able to buy it unless they had entered the ballot. So they had a ballot with a right to win, the right to kind of buy a bottle. So you entered, you waited for a while, and then you had an email to say you have been successful. You are able to buy a bottle if you want to. So that sense of scarcity and exclusivity that came through from that behavior signaled to consumers that this was a rare, unusual, exciting product that they absolutely wanted to get their hands on. So that whole approach drove a really effective brand building strategy. So it created momentum, it created excitement, it created anticipation and desire to access the brand, and was massively effective over social media. I think they had something like 17,000 entries to the first ballot for 2,500 bottles. So it was a hugely appealing concept for consumers. Coupled with this, obviously this brand is a startup effectively. So there were lots of commercial challenges along the way, primarily in terms of raising investment for further distilling and further growth of production. So while that was all happening, the business also introduced a second blended whiskey called Rosé While We Wait. So this was a product that could be tried before the release of the single malt to give an indicator of what the flavour might be like, to give people a sense of direction of the brand. And that was really successful in its sales figures leading up to launch. There was also the launch of a Hebridean gin, which again, it really successfully enabled revenue to build, enabled the business to invest in that valuable extra distilling in order to drive growth of the single malt brands. Okay. So what happened? I'm sure you're all dying to know. At the official launch, it's fair to say it was a huge success. So like I said, 17,000 ballot entries for those first 2,500 bottles. So obviously they flew off the shelf. Critical acclaim was very strong. So there was lots of engagement with influencers and whiskey critics, which were really driving demand as well. And it's fair to say that the premium priced first release post-launch I think was snapped up in less than 24 hours. So 30,000 bottles sold in half one of 2021 at that point. So really strong demand. It's still very hard to get a bottle. It's still selling really effectively at that £50 plus price point, which was the brand ambition. So it's been able to achieve that cut through in that challenging global traditional established marketplace. It's actually winning in terms of sales. Demand remains really strong, so that distribution strategy through those high-end retailers, bars, hotels, restaurants is really helping it carve out a premium niche in the marketplace, and that's seeming to be very effective. And added to that, it's also won a string of awards. So it's won the Scotch Whisky Masters Silver Award last year. The single malt achieved gold at the World Whisky Awards, was the best newcomer at the Scottish Whisky Awards, and the bottle design itself has also won the top prize at the Luxury Packaging Awards. So a really strong performance and a rounded performance from a brand point of view. So much so that the business is looking to invest in a second distillery and is looking at really being able to scale up production in order to capitalise on the level of demand that the brand has created. So a really lovely success story from a brand building point of view. And from an insight point of view, what should we think about and take away really in terms of learnings that we can take into other work in the future? I think the first thing I would say is the work that we did upfront with the client, really engaging on the hypotheses, understanding that challenge and understanding the varying ways that success could be carved out in this marketplace, and trying to understand those commercial realities as well. Taking that time was extremely valuable in not only informing our analysis, but also in fleshing out how we were going to make those layers of research work really effectively in order to stage insight and allow it to build across that journey as well. We saw really firsthand how pivotal it was to layer approaches to meet those different objectives. So that enabled us to be very keen in how we met our clients' budget, but also allowed real stretch in what we could achieve, and stretch in how we thought about the category as well. It also enabled us to stage our analysis. So because each stage or each layer met a different objective, it meant that we were learning and developing insight every step of the way, and stopping and learning and taking stock of that insight in our analysis and feeding that in from one stage to the next. So that was really important in ensuring we avoided duplication, and that we built more depth and breadth into the insight we were gathering, and also created further hypotheses for us to go out and think about. So how do we challenge that particular category truth? How do we understand what the role of bottle design needs to be in breaking some of those semiotic conventions, and understanding how we can kind of create new codes for the category. Our work kind of leaning into culture and leaning into the other markets was really pivotal in understanding the global category, first of all, but also how to start to future-proof any brand identity or direction that we were suggesting. So it enabled us to reject certain ideas as we went along, but also to build in understanding of why things might be working, and the longevity that they might have. And of course, we saw firsthand how valuable those listening techniques were. So being able to use visual and kind of verbal storytelling techniques helped us understand how those category truths were constructed and what was stood around them in terms of foundations, but also that gave us the clues as to how we could subvert those and what we needed to do to start to unpick them and challenge them in the future with the brand. So if we hadn't understood that kind of story piece, then we would have really struggled to recommend to the client how we could potentially challenge that with a new brand going forwards. And that's everything from me and from the Boxclever team. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and obviously if anyone has any questions, more than happy to answer those.
Hello, and thank you very much. That was really interesting. As somebody who adores malt, it's even more interesting to me. Did you do any, I mean, you obviously did. Does it appeal more to women or to men, or isn't there a discriminating factor?
That's a very good question, Luella, in that was one of our hypotheses going out, was from the client, is that there is a younger market out there. We need to find it. There is a female market out there. Do they just want whiskey cocktails, or do they want something else? So we had a lot of hypotheses around the gendered nature of whiskey. And through some of those storytelling exercises, I mean, obviously our sample was, broad and split between the genders, and we really were very inclusive in how we approached that. But actually we found some really interesting insights around using whiskey to build status, using whiskey to communicate around self-image and what whiskey said about you as a man and as a woman, where it was sometimes similar and sometimes different. So some of those learnings were actually really interesting and fed into that piece around a brand story with passion and emotion and connection. Was actually one of the unifying features across gender. Was what people really love to do is share a new whiskey and be the proud introducer of a new brand to their circle, whether that's friends or family who enjoy it with them, and that says a lot about them as an individual. So that's where courageous and modern and grounded in history and emotion and place really came from, that sense of, I want individual pride and individual connection with that story.
And has it been more successful in one country than another? I'm just wondering, looking at Japan
Yeah, good
Yes.
question. So again, one of the strategies for the brand, and I haven't really talked about this, but some of that first release was actually saved for the international markets, and there was always an international strategy around how the brand would grow, particularly in China and Japan to some extent, and in the US and potentially Germany as well, as big kind of consumption markets. So they have absolutely smashed it in those markets as well in terms of sales. Again, it's a very similar story. So whilst we didn't research in all markets because of budgetary constraints, actually we are able to really see the brand at play as successfully in those markets. So that's obviously, I guess, the power of a good identity as well.
I've got one more question, then I'll shut up and
Okay.
see whether anybody else has got any. I'm just curious, as a lover of malts. I mean, my experience started after a Michael Palin programme about the Cowl of La Calche. And I remember going to the hotel there, and my husband and I worked our way through all of their malts, doing 3 per evening. Where would this one sit in terms of taste compared with another malt?
Oh, that's a very personal question, Noella. I think you should try it yourself. Yeah, I mean, everyone has a different view, don't they? And I think one of the things the brand did really well was try and communicate taste over video as a medium. So they had a lot of the whiskey critics and whiskey tasters were quite engaged with the process, and they actually have a process by which they have it's 6 combinations of single malts that they distill, and that obviously that's a very closely guarded secret in terms of the actual combination, but there's lots of video on their blog and on their social of the tasters talking about what that experience is like and why it feels different. So I'm not sure I can answer that, but I would point you to the website and to their social media, where there's lots of far more qualified people than myself talking about the taste profile.
I've got an anonymous question here, which says, how long did the project take?
Okay, good question. It was about 12 weeks, 14, 16 weeks, something like that. But that's the kind of live research. I think we did spend quite a lot of time at the front and back end of that piece, really talking with our client. So that hypothesis and engagement piece up front, but also at the back end, there was lots of brand development conversation, really. And one of, at Boxclever, we are very keen to build relationships with clients, obviously, but we don't see a project starting and stopping in the traditional sense. So we like to help our clients formulate briefs and work with them really directly to do that before we even get into proposing an approach, and also be there for support as we have delivered insight, but also help them think about what that means and how they take that into the business from an activation point of view. So we don't technically charge for some of that, I suppose. I probably shouldn't say that. However, that's a really rewarding part of the process for us as insight professionals and commercial thinkers as well. So we like to be a bit nosy and poke our noses in.
Got 2 more questions come in. One is from David Preston, who says, could you say a little more about the storytelling methodologies you used, please?
Okay. So we used a few different ways to approach story. So we knew that storytelling would be quite important going into our phases of research. So we kind of built some of that into almost everything we did. So, for example, everybody were recruited, whether they were an expert consumer or somebody we chatted to, really quickly. We asked them to introduce themselves really loosely in terms of tell us about how you got, a bit like you just did, Luella, how you came to try whiskey, how it came to be in your world and what it means to you. So a really open storytelling question for all of those intros. And then for a lot of our pre-recruited participants, we encouraged them to do pre-tasked exercises where they did a mixture kind of collages, which they then brought to sessions and talked around. So we got them to talk about brands that they'd introduced to other people, brands that they were proud to be a kind of consumer of, and brands that they felt fitted with their identity, and those kinds of things, which really helped them start to unlock that story. So effectively, it was just a way of asking different questions and giving them tools to talk really openly from the heart about their understanding of both the category, but also those brands that they loved. And we had some fascinating stories, people talking about, the brands being a friend, brands being a part of their lives when they had traumatic experiences, or brands where they talked a lot about status and image and identity, and what that meant to be able to be the person that brought something that everybody loved to an encounter, and to be able to tell the backstory of that brand was really important. So they wanted an understanding of that story. So I don't think they're complicated techniques, but it's about being, I suppose, as a researcher, being courageous and letting them tell us what has meaning and emotional meaning and why. And then in our analysis, not glossing over that as just an individual anecdote, actually trying to look at all of those anecdotes and make sense in terms of what the threads that hung them all together were. So it was as much about analysis really as it was about the actual activity to tell.
Two more. An anonymous one first. Was the aim of the brand to pull whiskey drinkers away from established premium brands, or to find new whiskey drinkers? And I suppose that came about in the course of, what you were doing.
Yeah, it was a bit twofold. So there was definitely a steal share objective, because there were lots of premium. It's obviously quite an eclectic market. There's lots of premium brands out there already. And there was also a sense that some of those premium brands are a little bit kind of disconnected with consumers, or out of date or out of touch. So actually there was going to be quite an easy way to steal that share if we could get the storytelling around the brand right. But of course, there are a lot of stats in the whiskey market about that shift in it being a bit more female and a bit younger than ever before. So actually they wanted to capitalize on some of those natural shifts in the marketplace and really accelerate them for the brand. So it was twofold. I think as an entrepreneurial brand and a challenger brand, there was definitely a sense that we want consumers from lots of different places. We don't want to alienate and be too narrow in how we approach the market. So that was also driving that strategy.
I'm curious, I will ask you the other question you've got here. They are investing in a new distillery. Would they be tempted to come up with another brand?
That's an interesting question, Luella. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I suspect, knowing the business and the characters involved, that definitely won't be off the table. If it were felt to be necessary to reach a particular part of the market, then I don't think the business would be frightened of doing that again, given the journey that they've had. But equally, that they know that they've got a great brand here, so they want to obviously leverage that as much as they possibly can.
It's got a way to run.
Following on from the new distillery, and you've mentioned the brand is now scaling up. I wondered whether there's anything different they're going to do in terms of distribution channels or avenues now they're, I guess, growing as a brand.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So part of the growth is about export, is about being able to export further to other markets and have the capacity to produce volumes that allow for that. And obviously the internet is a wonderful place. So they have quite good sales, direct sales online and through some of the online providers as well. So there is a market that is, it crosses borders as well in that sense. So they are absolutely looking at just trying to kind of reach the demand that they think is out there at the moment.
Carol, and apologies, I pronounce it wrong. Carol Kuleza says, can you please tell us a little bit more about the ethnographic approach you've done in, for example, New York and London?
Okay, with pleasure. I had a team with me obviously on this project, and there was a little bit of infighting around who was going to go to New York and sit in whiskey bars and do some observations. So it was a very competitive project from a team point of view. So we obviously, in the true spirit of ethnography, we had an idea of what we thought we might be able to access through that approach, but we didn't have a set of kind of boundaries really to what we wanted to do. So we effectively went to New York and London. We had a list of places we thought might be interesting, and we did lots of very free flow observation literally in bar. So we picked a bar we thought would have an interesting premium kind of range, if you like, in terms of its spirits, and we did a bit of intercepts. We sat and watched, we sat at the bar and watched. So there were some really interesting insights here around how people use the bartender and ask advice, and how actually unfamiliar most people are with lots of the brands in this space, and how the semiotics of the behind the bar space are really important. So often bars will group bottles together that they think have a similar standing in the market, or similar tastes, or similar cues that they want to communicate, and often that is done by kind of perceived premiumness. So there were some interesting observations around bottle design, and how standout was created in those spaces in order to communicate those key credentials we knew that the brand was going to have to get across, and also spotting some gaps. There were clear gaps in modern, there was gaps in shape of bottle. A lot of the bottles still had those really long necks that we associate with whiskey bottles. So actually the more modern brands were starting to look at more curvaceous shapes, more squat shapes, more individual, square or quite bold designs were starting to come through in pack semiotics. So there was lots of what I would describe as just completely free flow observation, and then some interesting conversations with people who happened to be choosing at the time around some of their, what they were thinking about when they were making a choice, what was discounted and how they did that, and just getting an understanding of how people think about that category.
I love the bottle. The bottle is so beautiful.
It's gorgeous, isn't it? Absolutely love it. I have a bottle and I won't let my husband open it because it's too beautiful, and he's absolutely offended by the whole thing.
Has anybody else? Oh, I think there is another one. Hang on a minute. Let me just move down a bit. How would you have approached this work if briefed to do it in the last year, when there were so many restrictions on face-to-face research, observation, ethnography, workshops, etc.?
Excellent question, and in all honesty, I'm not entirely sure. I'm very grateful it wasn't last year, because I think it would have been a lot more difficult. That said, we have done some wonderful digital ethnography in the lockdown periods, so into topics that actually I hadn't imagined we would be able to achieve such good results. So things like mental wellness, people's health perceptions, people's love for their animal. We've done some amazing projects that have really involved consumers trying to share their world in a really free flow way with us over the internet. So using ethnographic platforms and using video conversational techniques to, whether that's group or individual, to great effect. So I'm sure we would have used a combination of those kinds of approaches, and had bars been open, we might have done a bit of observation along the way as well. And the semiotics work we would have probably been able to do in one form or other. So it wouldn't have been impossible, and we certainly wouldn't have shied away from that challenge, but I think it was better face to face, in the sense that we could understand more of that emotional space a bit more. But I don't think we would. So we quite often use techniques like letter writing, or using different ways for people to tell stories, or like little video selfies that are more kind of note to self kind of selfies. So those kinds of techniques, I think we could have got to some of that story and emotional connection objectives. I think we could have unlocked that in a more online format if we'd had to.
I must admit, I wouldn't have fancied shipping any of those bottles around the country for sampling. I doubt very many of them would have arrived intact, to be honest. Are there any more? I think we probably plumbed the depths. I'm going out to look for it afterwards, so I shall tax you as to where I might find one near me.
Okay.
Just to say thank you to both of you, to Keisha for introducing the award. Leslie says, fascinating, thank you. All the way from South Africa, from what I remember. So yes, thank you very much. I'd just like to say that there are a few things coming up on the AQR calendar. One of them is extreme prototyping on the 25th of February, shaping innovation pipelines, and there are 4 places left on that, and it sounds like an exciting one. And it's headed by Hannah Rogers, Head of New Business and Client Lead at Blue Yonder. There's a new check-in on the 28th of February, so look out for that. There is Tools for Change, Psychological Flexibility on Tuesday, the 1st of March, and there's 1 place left for that. There is a book club on the 1st of March, Anthrovision by Gillian Tett. And I know that there is a trends webinar, because I'm meant to be organising it, but I haven't got my act together, which will be in February, so watch this space. But thank you, all of you, and really interesting. So all hail. And I will
Thank you for listening.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.